I find Martin Luther King Jr. Day to be very complicated for our society, in part because I feel like we tend to simplify both King and our history. When I was a child, I remember hearing a narrative on Martin Luther King Jr., especially this weekend, that we celebrated Dr. King because in his time, society was incredibly racist. But his efforts and subsequent assassination changed our nation, healed our racist ways, brought people of color the genuine right to vote. And even if it wasn't perfect, we were largely no longer a racist society. I think everyone in this room knows just how off that narrative is. MLK did a lot, to be sure, but he definitely did not eradicate American racism. Sometimes I think that's part of the problem. Turning MLK into a savior takes away our responsibility. The work's been done. It sounds so comforting. I think the 90s saw a shift in that narrative, though. I've often heard that California's wake-up call was the Rodney King beating and riots. It was hard to think race relations were just fine after that. In New York, ours was the murder of Amadou Diallo. Amadou was a young black immigrant who was stopped by police because they didn't think he belonged. Standing outside his own apartment building, they asked for identification. And he reached to show his ID. Then 41 bullets pierced his body. He was just an unarmed black man entering his own house. We were mortified in New York. But our biggest wake-up call came a year later, when all 4 officers were acquitted. That day, kids all over New York walked out of school to protest. It was my first protest, and I noticed something disheartening. I felt incredibly safe in my Union Square protest because 90% of us were white. And I realized that the risk I was putting in to be there as a 15-year-old white girl was minimal. My friends from school who were with me, who happened not to be white, were visibly terrified of the police. Now, I imagine in this room, we have a range of how people see the police in relation to Black Lives Matter and how black and brown people are policed differently than white people are. But I think we can all agree that it is heartbreaking to grow up seeing the police as a symbol of your oppression, as people who hope to limit your opportunities. That is something I never had to contend with. Authority has always worked for my interests. And whether you agree or not, the perception makes sense given the overlap between police and KKK members in the 60s, or the statistics about how much more likely people of color are to be arrested for drug-related offenses despite no real difference in use, or the unarmed people of color that are killed out of a psychological assumption that they are dangerous because they are black. 21 years after Amadou Diallo was killed, has anything changed? Can we really make a difference? I'll admit, even I have my moments of doubt. Sometimes I think it's simply too much. Our musicians this morning made reference to doubting Thomas, who was one of the 12 disciples in the Easter story, who just couldn't believe that Jesus had risen. And I can relate to Thomas's doubt. Not just because I too can imagine being skeptical of seeing my dead friend, but I can relate to the desire for proof, to touch Jesus, watch him eat, make sure he's real. Because in his time of grief, he couldn't muster up the faith. And I think a lot of us feel that way about racism. We're grieving the hatred that we see all around us, the rise in hate crimes in the last few years, the incredible number of deportations, seeing children in cages, the feeling that white supremacists have only gotten bolder, louder, and more numerous. How do we combat it? Can we? Can we change the very fabric of American culture and society that is designed around racism? From slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. I want proof too. I want to know that my efforts will work. I don't want to go on faith. And that's why the way that we celebrate MLK Day can be so dangerous. We applaud him, as we should. But I feel we'd be doing him so much more justice by looking to what there is still to be done. By remembering he was a person with doubts and fears, just like we are. He didn't think justice would happen overnight. In fact, he didn't think it would happen in his lifetime, or that he'd even see a dent. But the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice because we are willing to bend it. Using that metaphor, as Theodore Parker had done, about the arc of the universe is intentional because it's not perceptible to the human eye. And sadly, we don't have a justice telescope. 3 years ago, I think our country had another awakening. Because I don't think we pretend to live in a post-racial society the way that we did after Obama was elected. It's out in the open, again, for all of us to see, though most of my colleagues of color would tell me that it always was. Language is barely coded, if at all, to stoke fears in others. And as time goes on, the opportunity gap has just gotten more and more notable, with one very important addition. The white working class, once a middle class, and a convenient reason to call black folks living in poverty lazy, is no longer a middle class. Those same families are now living in poverty too. And their poverty is being weaponized to find fault and blame in their decrease in stature. Immigrants are taking your jobs. Cities are taking your jobs. Environmental activists are taking your jobs. These are all clear ways to enrage rural white people living in poverty, to channel the blame. We know that people of color don't actually have it easier. We know that millions of people of color are still disenfranchised, that the education system is better designed to send those in poverty to prison than college, that inner city people of color will be disproportionately targeted and arrested by police. The dehumanization is in every one of our systems. That's why we talk about the system of racism and not just the people who are racist. Poverty and racism are so deeply enmeshed that I understand why there is often a debate among those who are liberal as to which is the greater threat. And here, I wonder, to break the bonds of poverty and racism, we need first to understand what empowers them. This is where we get to the part of MLK's legacy that many like to forget. King stated, "The fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both black and white, both here and abroad. Greed is the heart and soul of racism and poverty. And to break free and ultimately create the beloved community that we want to believe in, the community where, to take a Christian metaphor, the lion and the lamb live together, we must first take the claws off the lion and remove the teeth of capitalism, the violence that it relies on." King loved to talk about a parable in the Gospel of Luke about a rich man and a beggar named Lazarus. The beggar lived at the gate in constant pain from sores that were all over his body. And the rich man sees him every day, continuing his lavish lifestyle while taking no pity on the beggar. When they die, the beggar is elevated, saved, and the rich man degraded in hell. A theology most of us do not relate with. But even King, a staunch Christian, did not believe the story was actually about the afterlife, but a parable about how we live morally now, how we look to the pain of society and seek freedom. We elevate the marginalized and remember that it is not just the beggar whose freedoms are limited by a life of torment. The rich man isn't free either because he is enslaved to money. It's a reminder that there is no such thing as freedom for some. This is why MLK maintained that for his white brethren joining him in the fight, that they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. Liberation theology elevates the marginalized because, in truth, that elevates us all. So today, I don't want to see King as a savior or even a prophet. I want to remember the imperfect man who fought for all of our freedoms, who did not unequivocally succeed, but whose work is for us to continue. To have faith in genuine change calls for an incredible leap. And taking that leap doesn't mean that we will be releasing all of our doubts. Faith is not the absence of doubt. It's moving forward in spite of our doubt. Because King reminds us that there is freedom for none of us until there is freedom for all of us. That our doubts tap into a fundamental truth about who we are as people of faith. That true faith in racial justice recognizes a historical cowardice to relinquish privilege in the service of collective freedom. And as long as there is justice for only some, we are not a community of integrity. But the moral arc is long. And we, the beloved community, can bend it. I reject the idea of a singular person to lead the efforts towards liberation, because what we seek to do is create a collective salvation. Not the kind that relies on a God. It's the kind that only we can create in this life. Because collective salvation comes from collective liberation. And I have faith in community. I have faith that love overcomes greed. Because we have each other. We know what love in action looks like, and we can expand that to absolutely everybody. I don't know when. I may not see it. But freedom is coming. So let us march on. Blessed be, and amen.